Juvenile prisons are supposed to be safe places where troubled kids are sent for what might be a last chance to turn their lives around before adulthood. But instead of finding refuge from crime and mayhem, these kids often encounter a world far more dangerous than the one behind. Here are 10 of the toughest prisons for kids. February 2019. A Louisiana mother, Bridget Peterson, saw her son through a window of a holding cell at Ware Youth Center just 2 weeks after his birthday. Even for such a small boy, barely over 5 feet tall, the cell looked cramped. But just 4 days later, she received a call. Her son was dead by suicide. And as painful as that news was, the grieving mother would soon learn that yet another child at Ware Youth Center took his own life 2 days before. Further investigations also revealed that her son had been isolated in that cramped-up cell for at least 4 days, even though Louisiana state rules said he shouldn't have spent a single night there. The guards who were supposed to check on him every 15 minutes hadn't done so for more than 2 hours, just as they had neglected to check on the other boy. Both suicide cases got widespread attention and made national headlines. But what the public didn't know was that inside the walls at Ware, one of Louisiana's largest juvenile detention facilities, wards have been trying to kill themselves with stunning regularity. And the reason behind this is more disturbing than you think. It blurs the lines of physical violence, sexual assault, and psychological torment. At this detention center opening up in 1993, investigations have revealed that the guards ruthlessly beat and choke their wards, force them to endure sexual abuse for phone privileges, and bribe other wards with food to assault their peers. Now, besides the violence and sexual abuse, youths at the center are also subjected to racial imbalances. 3/4 of the children here are black, while all its leaders are white. Some believe this contributes to the reasons why many key witnesses in sexual and physical abuse cases are silenced. And you can argue that by some metric these kids committed crimes to be here, and that waives their right to the best of treatments, but that's where you'd be wrong. Because not every kid sent to this facility is a criminal. Some were sent there for nonviolent offenses or infractions as minor as skipping school, be it a day, a week, or a year. Almost every child sent to Ware never comes out the same. And on top of that, the wardens are literally pedophiles who concretely conceal their depraved actions under the juvenile system. There are dozens of ex-inmates who have come openly to detail their horrific experiences within this facility, but none of the persons involved ever get prosecuted. Maybe it's a reason inmates are drawn to taking their own lives. Between 2019 and 20, there were at least 64 suicide attempts at Ware, with more wards constantly tying socks, towels, and sheets around their necks to put an end to their misery. Some have even tried escaping the facility not for their freedom, but to get transferred to a different facility. So in essence, the Ware Youth Center might not be reforming these kids. Instead, it looks like it's breaking them even more, pushing their minds to the brink of madness and beyond. The Greater Tehran Penitentiary in Iran isn't just one of the toughest prisons for kids. It's one of the worst prisons in the world. Built in 2012, several thousand prisoners have been transferred to this facility from other prisons in the country. The worst of the worst are brought here to face harsher punishments for their crimes. And with an official capacity of 15,000 inmates, this prison is the largest detention facility in Iran. However, within this place is a special unit that houses juveniles. This unit is commonly called Wabash Valley, and at Wabash Valley, inmates say that the water is undrinkable, the washing facilities are faulty, and that the bathroom breaks are rationed. There's only hot water for half an hour a day. The wards are extremely dirty, and ladle full of lentils and stones plus frozen rotten sausages is all they get to eat. On top of this, there are more bedbugs and mice than there are people, making it safe to say that Wabash Valley really is on the other side of hell. No recreation is allowed, and even all bottles of mineral water used as dumbbells in other parts of the prison are banned in this unit. The sheer extent of overcrowding has turned personal hygiene into a joke, with many inmates suffering from skin conditions and diseases like hepatitis and AIDS. Now, each cell under Shash Valley has a ward housing an average of 500 people each, or more than double their official capacity. Many of the children here come from poorer backgrounds, while prison guards and managers usually try to avoid taking on duties on these wards because, put simply, they're among the worst jobs in the whole system. Aside from the sheer volume of work because of the overcrowding, the level of violence, gang fights, self-harm and suicide among prisoners in Shash Valley being so high it's pretty much impossible to take responsibility for it all. It's so disheartening to even imagine, but while the guards might avoid Shash Valley, convicted drug dealers do not. As a matter of fact, they use connections within the prison staff to get themselves to these wards. The ward is not only staffed full of pills and medication, but is also a good hunting ground for future customers. These drug dealers sometimes beat random prisoners to take out their frustration. They beat them so much that they get tired themselves, and whenever a teenager wants a transfer to a different prison or sent to solitary confinement, prison guards destroy him on the outside of his cell first with pipes and sticks. Some time ago, an 18-year-old boy got his eye knocked out from his socket by heavy blows he received during his brutal punishment. It's so crazy that even with these harsh conditions, any teenager who dares complain about this only gets beaten harder. This alone worsens the psychological distress they're under, which could lead to greater risk of suicide and self-harm. This nightmarish place is unfortunately the ultimate end result for most of these teenagers. Many of them grow up desperately sad, going without bread or their basic human rights. No one cares about what their future looks like, nor how they might begin to patch up their wounded bodies and souls once they do get out, if they ever do. Now, the true toughness of this facility is best illustrated through a story of one of its residents, David. Now, David was a troubled teen brought to this place after being convicted for a third-degree battery charge. He'd been treated at 5 psychiatric centers, and when he was frustrated, he would repeatedly bang his head against the concrete wall of his cell. On March 16, 1997, David was taken upstairs to a quiet room, also known as a timeout cell for troublemakers. They took away his brown jumpsuit, and he was in his underwear. 2 older, bigger boys in green jumpsuits were already in the 11 by 11 foot cell by the time he entered. Now, the guard who dropped him off told these 2 dudes to assault David, but leave no marks. And for the next half hour, numerous staff members and even other teenagers heard David repeatedly screaming and crying for help. He was beaten, spat on, slapped, and taunted. Those older boys twisted a sheet into knots and beat him with it before one of the boys stuck a broom handle into his rectum. He was removed from the area for a few hours, and then despite his desperate pleas to be left alone, David was taken back to the quiet cell, where 2 other boys slapped him around, threw water on him, and hit him on the head with combs and brushes while cursing at him. David had reported the case and all 4 boys were identified, but they denied raping him. It was also at this moment that the authorities linked David to another assault case where he was hogtied with his face placed on the concrete floor by a guard who watched him struggle in his underwear. And as you might have imagined, David's horrific experiences weren't an isolated case. Rather, it's one of dozens of abusive incidents buried in the state's files, or in the memories of staff members and children too frightened or too discouraged to report them. At this facility, young prisoners have been degraded verbally, physically, and even sexually abused, hogtied, forced to sleep outside in freezing weather, threatened with punishment, and even death by staff members if the children reported the abuse. Now, these staff members have slugged young prisoners in the face, and then refused to allow him to be treated by a nurse. They would turn on the air conditioning full blast in naked cells overnight. Troubled kids as young as 11 have been taken away from their parents and placed in the state's custody, only to be subjected to the whims of untrained staff members, some with criminal backgrounds. Now, originally, the more violent offenders were segregated, but when issues of overcrowding came up, that became a lost luxury. Murderers began rooming with shoplifters, with credit card abusers, and children who hunted deer out of season. Plus, it originally was expected that the boys and the handful of girl residents would move on from the facility in around 30 to 45 days. But they were wrong. The average length of stay at the Q&A center eventually rose to 83 days, with one boy staying up to 9 months. The overcrowding was so overwhelming that girls began sleeping in the shower area with pillows and blankets. To add to the tension, the more vulnerable young prisoners were forced to barter food to ward off beatings or attacks by sexual predators in these crowded cells. Toothbrushes and pencils were sharpened into shivs to be used on staff members or opposing gang members, and I could go on and on about how messed up living within this facility really is for these kids, but the bottom line is that those same mentally retarded and emotionally disturbed teenagers kept the facility in an uproar, provoking an already unstable atmosphere and putting their own lives further at risk.
Families held a candlelight vigil outside the Department of Corrections in Jackson today. They're asking the state to shut down Walnut Grove Juvenile Facility. Today marked 1 year since a violent fight at the detention facility that left several injured and sparked an investigation.
Serving time in prison isn't supposed to be pleasant, nor, however, is it supposed to include being raped by fellow prisoners or staff, beaten by guards for the slightest provocation, driven mad by long-term solitary confinement, or even killed off by medical neglect. Unfortunately, this is the reality of not hardened criminals but mere young prisoners at Walnut Grove.
We were fooled because we were told that Walnut Grove was supposed to be a place where the children were supposed to be rehabilitated, educated, and taught skills that would help them transition back into society. Instead, what they are getting are excessive lockdowns, an environmental infested with violence and drugs, supported and sustained by the guards for profit.
For years, the young prisoner at Walnut Grove Correctional Facility faced horrors that should be unrealized anywhere in the civilized world. This facility was established in 1990 and sits on 72 acres of land in the small town of Walnut Grove, southern Leake County, Mississippi. From 96 until 2012, the facility's mission was to house youthful offenders. But that mission soon changed when adult offenders started getting assigned to this facility. Guards regularly having sex with young detainees, and the facility's pattern of brutal rapes among prisoners is arguably the worst of any facility anywhere in the United States. Guards are deemed excessively violent, beating, kicking, and punching handcuffed and defenseless youths, and even frequently subjecting them to chemical restraints like pepper spray, even for the most insignificant infractions. The guards at Walnut Grove also sell drugs on site and stage gladiator-style fights among the detainees, just like you would set up your average dogfight. And it's not even crazy to think that there was gambling involved, because it was like a payday for those guards. You gotta understand that a lot of times these guards are usually in the same gang as the detainees. So if an inmate wanted something, they might get it done for him. And if inmates wanted a cell popped open to handle some violent business about fighting or something of that sort, they pretty much made it happen. Any kid who would try to complain or report these incidents to higher authorities faced harsh retribution, including long stints in solitary confinement and even starvation. These conditions at Walnut Grove ultimately violated the U.S. Constitution, not to mention state and federal civil and criminal laws. Maybe it's because it's owned by private companies, but in all honesty, it is essentially lawless. It was temporarily shut down in 2016 but reopened in 2021 by the Mississippi Department of Corrections. There are at least 1,400 inmates residing there, and hopefully it gets reformed. October 2021, lawyers and a judge gathered in an East Baton Rouge juvenile courtroom for an update on a teenager detained after joyriding in a stolen car. The teen appeared on the screen, and after talking about the conditions in the lockup where he was held, the entire court went silent. He was being kept in round-the-clock solitary confinement. He was getting no education in violation of state and federal law, nor was he getting court-ordered substance abuse counseling. The tipping point was that not the judge nor any of the lawyers present that day had even heard of the facility where he was held, the Acadiana Center for Youth. This detention center, located in St. Martinville, is regarded as Louisiana's harshest juvenile lockup. It was secretly opened by the state of Louisiana to regain control of the most troubled kids in their care. And here's the thing, solitary confinement isn't something many governments considered appropriate for teenagers, but at Acadiana, it's almost a norm. Detainees are kept alone in their cells for at least 23 hours a day, for weeks on end. They would be shackled by handcuffs and leg irons when let out to the shower, and are given nothing more than meals, slid through slots in their doors. Some teens, out of rage, take this brief moment of human contact to fling their feces and urine at detention guards. In turn, the guards would get violent by pepper spraying or even getting physical with them. Now, after the testimony in court, the conditions in Acadiana improved a bit, but not on all grounds. Some, but not all teens were now allowed out of their cells during the day, and education is now being offered. And it's still less than what's required by the law. Kids are being shackled when they leave the common area in front of their cells, and the majority of them, in fact 80% of them, are still being abused and neglected. And yes, some of these teens at Acadiana were brought in for being the absolute worst at previous detention centers. So if you think about it, you gotta keep a close eye on them no matter what. But at the end of the day, some experts believe that these measures are counterproductive. Detention is meant to help them get better, but when they get treated like this, like hardened criminals, it just leads to more bad behavior. In the belly of the Cleveland Youth Detention Center, located in Cleveland, Australia, is a school with teachers but often no students. This facility has accommodation blocks filled with hundreds of school-age children being kept in solitary confinement, wallowing in circumstances that they weren't even meant to be in, all because there aren't many guards to let them out. You see, unlike other detention centers so far, the problem with this facility is quite unique, and that would be their lack of staff. In June 2023, one inmate from inside this place, Jenny, gave authorities a grim reality of what really goes on inside. Jenny was remanded at Cleveland for 89 days, and of that time, she spent 47 days locked up in her cell for 21 hours and wouldn't even get a chance at an education during those 3 months. Ironically, this place does have an education and training center, which is a school furnished with art rooms, a recording studio, workshops, and about 30 teaching staff. However, it's off limits to the students. So why employ teachers if they're not going to teach anybody? Well, the answer's simple. A union agreement within the facility demands that when units are understaffed, children are kept in continuous cell occupation or blackout mode, which has the effect that they are restricted to their cell blocks, kept mostly in solitary confinement, and do not attend classes, activities, or rehabilitation programs. Now, that agreement wouldn't have been an issue if there were enough guards on board. But being employed as a guard here is a low-paid and high-risk job, and the few guards who do get employed here are instructed to do whatever they can to avoid risk, which means keeping kids in their cells a lot. And if a kid gets involved in any form of violence, 2 guards are required to accompany them everywhere. And since there aren't even enough guards to accompany one child at a time, most violent children only leave their cells for their court hearing. And here's the troubling part. Jenny wasn't even a criminal, at least not a hardened one. She came from a stable home in a remote North Queensland community, had done well in school, and was an avid lover of art, until a few years ago when she began dating a particular boy and eventually got caught up in the youth justice system. And just like Jenny, there are hundreds of children who, for small offenses, got sent to this detention center, and who would never be the same once they got out.
In the Philippines, children of 9 can be charged and convicted of a criminal offence. Thousands of children are jailed inside adult prisons for the pettiest of crimes.
The Pasay City Prison in the Philippines is officially called House of Hope. But that hope gets pulverized by the reality those detained are forced to accept in this miniature version of hell. One detainee here, Jerry, was caught after fleeing his house due to violence and constant fights with his father and other family members. In turn, he was sent to this youth prison, where, on multiple occasions, he'd been forced to endure sexual abuse from older inmates. The first time it happened, Jerry got dragged from his bed and was taken to the bathroom, where those older inmates would take turns abusing him. And just like Jerry, hundreds of young detainees have faced similar, if not worse, situations. Now, what's horrible here is that this facility, under law, was only meant to house teens between 15 and 18 years of age. However, some vulnerable young children from troubled homes are sometimes swept up into this hellhole, even for minor misdemeanors, giving them an experience that they'd forever struggle to recover from. And isn't it ironic that this place, built for reformation and education, has now turned into a pit where children are treated like caged animals, where children are also mixed up with the adult population for committing the smallest of crimes? Just take the case of Justin after he got transferred to Passay City for breaking his parents' house rules. Once he got here, he was ruthlessly beaten by other boys, punched in the chest, stomach, and even chin. To Justin, this wasn't education or reform. It was an act of demanded revenge. This is the mindset ingrained in many minors, some even younger than Justin and Jerry, as they endure such harsh conditions. There are about 55 government-run juvenile prisons in the Philippines, but that is well short of the 114 they had estimated it needs to properly house troubled juveniles. Yet even of those 55, only about 8 comply with the law. The rest are either understaffed or run horribly by the people who couldn't care any less. The 22-kilometer Stewart Highway is one fun route for Australians to drive by. For many, it's the road out of the Northern Territory of Alice Springs, but for a few, it's a road to hell, where children are left to fall through the cracks. Alice Springs Youth Detention Center is an Australian medium to maximum security prison for juveniles of all ages. The center was originally designed for use as a short-term holding and a remand center for up to 4 days, and could originally hold up to 10 juveniles. Once it was fully occupied, new juveniles were moved to another detention center, the Don Dale Juvenile Detention Center in Darwin, to be housed till the completion of their sentence. And as time went by, this facility was expanded for longer-term detention of up to 18 detainees. It was a step in the right direction, but it became popular for the wrong reasons. In 2018, there was overcrowding at the facility, with 24 youths being held in total. Graphic footage of repeated abuse of children at this facility also got featured in ABC's 4TV program Australia's Shame. The program also showed a boy shackled and hooded in a chair at the facility, while further investigations from the press revealed that detainees were slowly dying at this place, and the poison killing them was loneliness. At Alice Springs, almost every detainee is extremely bored to death as the days go by due to lack of pre-scheduled activities. They get up, they shower, sometimes they go to school, sometimes they can do work party, which basically means cleaning the cages they're kept in. The irregularities associated with this place caught the attention of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and he would claim that Australia was violating the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment, to which they were a party. And after other human rights organizations began chiming in, they've been forced to renovate this facility. Now it's a world-class high-tech facility designed to deliver a range of programs to detainees. It is now a state-of-the-art facility, but many fear it's only a matter of time before Alice Springs Youth Detention Center goes back to that hellish nightmare it once was. The Bimur Facility in northern Canberra, Australia, houses the most troubled young offenders aged 10 to 21. Its purpose is to see the rehabilitation of these young kids, but within its walls, human rights aren't merely neglected. They've become an extinct concept. Built in 2008 following the closure of another scandal-plagued detention facility, Quamby Centre, the Bimur was opened by the Australian government in the country's capital city. For the initial years after its opening, Bimur served its purpose to the fullest, and it wasn't until 2011 that this detention center gained its notoriety. It all began when a girl filed a lawsuit alleging human rights breaches at this facility. According to her story, the young lady was an Aboriginal Indigenous Australian who got separated from the general population and placed in the facility's core unit. Now that unit is used for both incoming prisoners and for the segregation of detainees. Yet this girl was kept there for almost 2 months. She also had several culturally significant personal items removed from her room, including her artwork and Koori Mail newspapers. And while the Bimur management denied her allegations, they were hit from behind with a set of new ones. A former warden at Bimur, now a guilt-stricken whistleblower, wrote a series of letters to politicians and the Australian government. Now in this letter, the whistleblower painted a horrifying picture of life inside this place that left everyone in shock. In his words, he said, "I'd witnessed young people try to kill themselves and cut themselves until they bled. I'd watched and been involved in uses of force where the young person screamed for their mom or dad. The whistleblower went further to recall an incident years back in which a detainee smashed their head on the concrete after guards threw him to the floor. The hands were cuffed behind their back, and they were unable to break the fall. The sound it made was sickening, and I thought for sure they had split their skull. And finally, he wrote that guards encouraged detainees to fight each other if there was ever a problem. Detainees at Bimur are also periodically supplied with huge volumes of alcohol and drugs and are, more times than not, victims of sexual abuse. And if you're wondering why this detention center now operates in stark contrast to its original purpose, well, there might be a good number of reasons for that, including one where the current staff members said the lack of resources and training has created an environment where they are now concerned for their own safety when dealing with extremely dangerous detainees. I mean, these staff are literally scared for their own life. How do you deal with that? Wabash Valley Correctional Facility in Indiana is notorious for its harsh living conditions, particularly for young offenders, and it's been tagged as one of the toughest prisons for kids due to several systemic issues, one of which is overcrowding. At Wabash, getting a place to comfortably sleep is almost impossible. Many prisoners, including young offenders, are placed in restricted housing units or solitary confinement for extended periods, often without due process. The units are plagued with issues like unsanitary conditions, lack of proper nutrition, and even extreme temperatures. Young offenders have also reported being given meals labeled not for human consumption and facing contamination of their food with saliva or feces by correctional officers. That in itself is mind-boggling. But it doesn't end here. When it comes to the abuse of power, Wabash Valley guards take the crown. Cases of staff members destroying prisoners' personal belongings and religious materials out of spite have been reported. Staff members also engage in nepotism, using their positions to target and retaliate against inmates who speak out or file grievances against them. Sometimes they also utilize behavior modification techniques involving turning inmates against each other, like dogs without a leash. In 2018, young inmates at the Secure Housing Unit under Wabash initiated a hunger strike to protest the deplorable conditions, including insufficient food, freezing cell temperatures, and constant surveillance by guards. In turn, the administration quickly retaliated by filing disciplinary reports against the strikers, which, if we're being honest, just further proves the corruption within this facility. Now, this place is still in operation, but just like the 9 others so far, we can only hope that these kids get better treatment somehow, or even still, hope for a life filled with redemption.